Millions dead, cities burning, Europe bleeding from every border. And when the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, one question echoed louder than any celebration. Who will pay? The generals, the commandants, the architects of genocide. Everyone knew their names. Everyone saw them at Nuremberg, hands folded, faces blank, listening to charges no human should ever hear spoken aloud. But there was another group, quieter, more ordinary, the neighbors who whispered to the Gestapo, the wives who turned in husbands, the clerks who kept the lists, the citizens who made terror possible with a phone call, a letter, a nod at the right moment. Between 1933 and 1945, ordinary Germans filed hundreds of thousands of denunciations. They sent people to camps with their words. They ended lives with accusations. They fed the machine. Then the machine stopped. What happened to them? Did they hang alongside the men who gave the orders? Did they vanish into the rubble? Did they walk free? The answer is colder than you think. If you value documented post-war justice history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the National World War II Museum's detailed analysis published in August 2021, examining 13,600 German-run trials between 1945 and 1949. And from Andrew Sinaida's Indirect Perpetrators, the Prosecution of Informers in Germany, published by Lexington Books in 2010, which analyzed 7,674 suspected denunciation cases prosecuted between 1945 and 1964. These are not secondary accounts or Wikipedia summaries. These are primary archival records from occupation courts and German judicial files. Now back to the information. May 8th, 1945, Germany surrenders. Within weeks, Allied forces establish occupation zones. American. British, French, Soviet, each zone gets its own military government. Each government faces the same impossible task: sort through 12 years of complicity and decide who should answer for what. The Allies know about the camps, they've seen the footage, they've walked through Dachau and Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald, they know about the 6 million Jews murdered, they know about the political prisoners, the Romani, the disabled, the homosexuals, the dissidents. They know about the scale, but scale creates a problem. How do you prosecute a nation? The Nazi Party had 8.5 million members by the war's end. The SS had over 800,000. The Gestapo had 16,000 active officers in Germany alone in 1944. Then there were the collaborators, the informers, the people who never wore a uniform but made the system function with their cooperation. By the end of 1945, 3.5 million former Nazis await classification in the American zone alone. 42% of public officials had been dismissed by the end of the winter of 1945 to 1946. But dismissal is not prosecution. Firing is not justice. The Allies create two tracks. High-level criminals go to international tribunals. The big names, the architects, Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, Albert Speer, Julius Streicher. These men face the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg starting November 20th, 1945. The trial runs until October 1st, 1946. 19 defendants are convicted. 12 are sentenced to death. 10 hang on October 16th, 1946, in the gymnasium at Nuremberg. Göring swallows cyanide the night before. This is the trial the world watches, but it's not where the denunciators go. The informers, the grudge reporters, the neighbors who turned in neighbors, they face a different kind of justice. Lower courts, German judges, Allied oversight, and a legal category that didn't exist before 1945. The crime of denunciation between 1945 and 1949. German courts operating in the American, British, and French zones conduct roughly 13,600 trials. 4,667 convictions result. The National World War II Museum's archival analysis from August 2021 breaks down the charges. 38.3% of all trials prosecuted in this period are for denunciation. Not murder, not assault, not theft. Denunciation, informing, reporting your neighbor to the secret police. This is the most prosecuted crime category in immediate post-war Germany. More than crimes against political opponents, more than November pogrom violence, more than any other single offense. 38.3%. That translates to approximately 5,200 prosecutions for denunciation between 1945 and 1949. 5,200 cases. 5,200 trials where someone stood accused of using their voice as a weapon under Nazi rule, but prosecuted does not mean convicted. Andrew Sinaida's Indirect Perpetrators book provides the cold numbers from a broader timeline. Between 1945 and 1964, 7,674 cases of suspected denunciation are prosecuted across all German courts. Out of those 7,674 prosecutions, only 603 result in conviction. 603. That's a conviction rate of 7.8%, less than 8 people convicted for every 100 prosecuted. The numbers get worse when you look at sentences. Penalties range from suspended sentences to life imprisonment in extreme cases, but the average sentence length is stunningly lenient. Most convicted denunciators receive prison terms of less than 2 years. The prosecution rate is high. The conviction rate is brutal. The punishment rate is almost non-existent. Why? The answer sits in the legal structure the Allies create and the Germans inherit. Control Council Law No. 10, issued December 20th, 1945, gives German courts the power to prosecute crimes against humanity. The law defines the concept broadly. Atrocities and offenses including murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, imprisonment, torture, rape, or other inhumane acts committed against any civilian population. Denunciation qualifies. If your report to the Gestapo led to someone's imprisonment, deportation, or death, you committed a crime against humanity under Law No. 10. The law offers advantages. It makes no distinction between perpetrator and accomplice. It rejects the defense of superior orders. It provides penalties higher than the German Criminal Code, which maxed out at 15 years for anything short of death or life. But there's a problem. Law No. 10 is Allied law. It's occupation law. It's foreign law imposed on German courts. And by 1951, massive German pressure forces the Allies to prohibit its use in German courts. After 1951, denunciation cases must be prosecuted under the German Criminal Code of 1871, a code that was in force during the Nazi era and never explicitly outlawed informing. The German Criminal Code becomes the knife that cuts both ways. On one hand, it allows defense attorneys to argue that their clients acted lawfully under the laws that existed at the time. If a Nazi statute said you could report anti-Hitler speech, and you reported anti-Hitler speech, you followed the law. On the other hand, prosecutors try to argue that Nazi statutes were void because they violated fundamental principles of justice and morality. This creates a legal paradox. Was Nazi law actually law? If yes, then denunciators acted legally. If no, then how do you prosecute someone for violating law that wasn't law? German courts split on this question. Some invoke the Radbruch formula, named after legal philosopher Gustav Radbruch. Radbruch argued in 1946 that extreme injustice is not law. If a statute is so morally repugnant that it contradicts the basic conscience of decent humans, it lacks the nature of law entirely. Courts using this formula can declare that Nazi statutes were void from the start, making denunciations illegal even when they occurred. But not all courts accept this. Some argue it's retroactive lawmaking. You can't punish someone today for doing something that was legal yesterday, even if yesterday's law was evil. One case becomes famous, the Grudge Informer case, 1949. A German woman is prosecuted for illegally depriving her husband of his liberty. In 1944, while he was home on leave from the army, she denounced him to the authorities for making insulting remarks about Hitler. She wanted him gone. She was having an affair. The remarks violated Nazi statutes. He was found guilty. He was sentenced to death. The sentence wasn't executed. He was sent to the front instead. He survived the war. After the war, he pressed charges. Her defense, she acted according to the law. The Nazi statute made anti-Hitler remarks illegal. She reported a crime. The court at the Oberlandesgericht Bamberg finds her guilty. The judges rule that Nazi statutes were contrary to the sound conscience and sense of justice of all decent human beings. They declare the statute void. She receives a sentence, but the legal reasoning becomes controversial. The case sparks a debate in jurisprudence that lasts decades. Philosophers H. L. A. Hart and Lon Fuller argue over it in the Harvard Law Review in 1958. Hart says the court should have used retroactive law and been honest about it. Fuller says the court correctly recognized that unjust law is not law. The woman served time, but thousands of others did not. The gap between prosecution and conviction widens because of evidence problems. Witnesses are dead. Records are destroyed. The Gestapo burned its files before the Allies arrived. Gestapo case files are rarely found intact. Without documentation, it's the word of the denounced against the word of the denouncer. And after 12 years of Nazi rule, many witnesses don't trust the courts. They don't trust the judges, many of whom served under the Nazis. They don't trust the prosecutors, some of whom prosecuted under Nazi law. They don't want to relive trauma in a courtroom. They don't want to face their informers again. So they don't testify. Cases collapse. Then there's motive. German courts require proof that the denunciation was malicious. If you reported someone because you genuinely believed they were breaking the law, even if the law was evil, you might not be guilty. If you reported someone out of personal spite, to get rid of a romantic rival, to settle a grudge, to steal property, you're guilty. But proving spite is nearly impossible. An examination of 213 denunciations in Düsseldorf shows that 37% were motivated by personal conflicts. 39% had no motive that could be established. 24% were motivated by support for the Nazi regime. If prosecutors can't prove personal malice, conviction becomes almost impossible. The denouncer says they were acting as a loyal German. The court can't prove otherwise. Case dismissed. The social context matters too. Robert Gelatelli's analysis of Gestapo files from cities like Würzburg shows that of 84 cases of Rassenschande, race defilement, sexual relations with non-Aryans, 45 were started because ordinary people denounced someone. 54%. 2 started from government branches. 20 from interrogations about other matters. 4 from Nazi Party organizations. 2 from political evaluations. 11 have no listed source. None started from Gestapo surveillance. The Gestapo was tiny. In Würzburg, 22 officers oversaw 840,000 people. In Düsseldorf, 126 officers for 500,000 residents. In Essen, 43 officers for 650,000 people. The secret police wasn't Big Brother, it was a skeleton crew that relied entirely on informers. Without denunciations, the Nazi terror state doesn't function. Ordinary Germans made it work, but post-war Germany doesn't want to hear that. By the late 1940s, Germans are exhausted. They've lost the war. Their cities are rubble. Millions are dead. Millions more are displaced. The economy is destroyed. They're occupied by foreign armies. They're cold and hungry. The last thing they want is more trials, more accusations, more judgments about what they did or didn't do during the war. A poll taken in the late 1950s reveals that 57% of Germans still think National Socialism was a good idea that was just carried out poorly. 57%, more than half the country. The appetite for prosecuting denunciators evaporates. Public opinion turns hostile. Germans start calling the trials victor's justice. They claim the Allies are hypocrites. They point to Soviet crimes at Katyn. They say the British bombed Dresden. They demand that Germany move forward, not backward. Cold War politics accelerate the collapse. By 1947, the Soviet Union is the enemy. The Western Allies need West Germany as an ally against communism. They need German cooperation. They need German industrial capacity. They need German soldiers. Prosecuting hundreds of thousands of Germans for wartime collaboration suddenly seems counterproductive. American military governor Lucius D. Clay starts commuting sentences. Convicted Nazis are released early. The denazification program, which was supposed to purge Nazi influence from all levels of German society, gets handed over to German authorities in March 1946. The Germans create tribunals run by Germans. The system becomes corrupted almost immediately. Nazis buy and sell denazification certificates on the black market. Perselscheine, they're called whitewash certificates, named after laundry detergent. Fines are assessed in Reichsmarks, which are worthless. In Bavaria, denazification minister Anton Pfeiffer reinstates 75% of officials the Americans dismissed and reclassifies 60% of senior Nazis into lower categories. The system loses credibility. By 1951, denazification is officially abolished. The trials slow and stop. Ilse Koch is one of the few who faces sustained prosecution, but even her case shows the contradictions. Wife of Buchenwald Commandant Karl Otto Koch, she held no official position but wielded immense power in the camp. She was known as the Kommandus. Prisoners were forced to call her eine gnädige Frau, a gracious lady. She rode horses through the camp. She beat prisoners. She reported inmates for punishment that resulted in death. She allegedly commissioned items made from tattooed human skin, though this was never conclusively proven. In August 1943, she and her husband were arrested by the SS itself for embezzlement and unauthorized murders. Karl was convicted and executed in April 1945. Ilse was acquitted for lack of evidence. After the war, American authorities arrested her on June 30th, 1945. She stood trial at Dachau in April 1947 alongside 30 other Buchenwald defendants. She was charged with participating in a common design to commit war crimes. On August 14th, 1947, she was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. She was 7 months pregnant at sentencing, which likely saved her from a death sentence. But her sentence was reviewed. Lawyers and the deputy judge, advocate for war crimes office, found little convincing evidence. General Lucius Clay reduced her sentence to 4 years. She was released on October 17, 1949. The same day, West German authorities arrested her. She faced a new trial under German law for abusing German citizens. In January 1951, she was convicted again and sentenced to life imprisonment. She spent 16 more years in prison. On September 1st, 1967, she hanged herself in her cell with bedsheets. She had been imprisoned for almost 24 years. She is the exception, not the rule. Most denunciators never face trial at all. By 1950, when international concerns about the Cold War eclipse interest in prosecuting World War II crimes, trials outside Germany largely cease. Most convicted perpetrators who weren't executed are released during the 1950s. In 1955, less than a decade after the Cold War begins, the Western Allies end the official occupation of West Germany and reconstitute the German army. As part of this process, the Western Allies release more than 3,300 incarcerated Nazis. Among them are 3 men convicted at the International Military Tribunal: Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, Walter Funk, and Konstantin von Neurath. If Nuremberg defendants walk free within a decade, what chance do ordinary informers have? The answer is almost none. The German judicial system, after 1951, becomes increasingly lenient. Between 1946 and 2005, cases are brought against 140,000 individuals in West Germany and United Germany. Only 6,656 are convicted of Nazi crimes. The vast majority of sentences, 4,993, are prison terms of up to 2 years. Only 164 individuals are eventually sentenced as perpetrators of murder rather than for lesser crimes. 164 convictions for murder out of 6 million people murdered in what we call the Holocaust. Historian Mary Fulbrook writes that legal systems, political considerations, and social practices were simply not up to the task of dealing with state-sponsored violence on this scale. The Federal Republic of Germany refuses to apply retroactive law to Nazi crimes of genocide. Nazi criminals are tried as ordinary criminals under the German Criminal Code. Courts accept the defense of superior orders. They accept claims that defendants tried to make victims' deaths easier as mitigating factors. They hand out light sentences. West German law, in effect, if not intention, condones obedience to a deadly regime and condemns only those who individually stepped beyond Nazism's already murderous limits. The immediate post-war period sees the most trials, the most convictions, and the most severe sentences. Then the numbers drop. The rate of conviction falls. The severity of sentences decreases consistently. In 1966, a special conference of legal experts meets under the German Bar Association. They point to the trend of fewer convictions and less severe sentences. They call for changes. Nothing changes. The Tilsit-Einsatzgruppen trial before the district court in Ulm in 1958 reveals the extent of crimes committed in the East. Suddenly aware of unsolved Nazi crimes, authorities established the Central Office for the Investigation of Nazi Crimes in Ludwigsburg. Indictments increase in the following 2 decades. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials run from December 20th, 1963 to August 20th, 1965. 22 defendants who served at Auschwitz stand trial. Of the approximately 8,200 camp personnel who survived the war, most were never tried in the immediate post-war period. The Frankfurt trial is a German court prosecuting Germans under German law. It sets a new standard, but by then, nearly 20 years have passed. For denunciators specifically, the window closes even faster. The crime of denunciation requires proof of malice, proof of harm, proof of causation. Did your report lead directly to imprisonment, deportation, or death? Can you prove it? Can you prove you knew it would? Can you prove you wanted it to? Defense attorneys exploit every gap. They argue their clients believed they were upholding the law. They argue their clients feared punishment for not reporting. They argue their clients didn't know what would happen after the report was filed. They argue the state, not the informer, committed the crime. They argue that holding citizens responsible for state actions sets a dangerous precedent. Courts often agree. The denouncer walks free. The denounced are dead. Some denouncers disappear into ordinary life. They change cities. They change names. They remarry. They find work. They integrate into post-war society. Teachers who singled out Jewish students for abuse continue teaching. Clergy who applauded Hitler continue leading congregations. Civil servants who processed applications, stripping Jews of citizenship, continue in government. One example comes from Inge Deutschkron's Life After Survival. Gustav Adolf Gedat had stated in 1935 that God ordered hunters to chase Jews to where God wants them. This did not prevent Mr. Gedat from continuing his career in post-war Germany. Deutschkron, a German Jew who spent the war in hiding in Berlin, documents the infestation of former Nazis in the new Federal Republic. The silence is impenetrable. Families don't talk. Children don't ask. Parents don't explain. The generation that lived through Nazism rebuilds cities, births the economic miracle, and refuses to confront the past. The legal question of whether informers committed crimes becomes a philosophical debate rather than a practical prosecution. The grudge informer case enters law school curricula. Students analyze it as a thought experiment. They debate whether unjust law is law. They discuss the limits of legal positivism. They write papers on the Radbruch formula. The actual woman in the actual case becomes a footnote. The thousands of other denouncers become abstractions. The system prefers theory to action. Theory doesn't require arrests. Theory doesn't require courtrooms. Theory doesn't require Germans to admit what they did. The denunciation system worked because ordinary people participated willingly. The Gestapo had 16,000 active officers in 1944 for 66 million people. That's one officer for every 4,125 residents. Surveillance at that scale is impossible without help, and help came freely. Of the 15% of Gestapo cases that started from surveillance, the rest started from tips. 40% of those tips were personally motivated. Grudges, affairs, property disputes, jealousy. Germans denounced each other not because the Gestapo forced them, but because denouncing was easy and often profitable. You could take someone's apartment after they were deported. You could take someone's business after they were arrested. You could get rid of a romantic rival. You could settle an old score. All you needed was a report. The state did the rest. After the war, this uncomfortable truth creates cognitive dissonance. Germans want to be victims of Nazi tyranny, not participants in it. They want to have resisted, not collaborated. They want to have hidden Jews, not reported them. The myth of collective ignorance takes root. We didn't know about the camps. We didn't know about the murders. We couldn't do anything. We had no choice, but the denunciation records prove otherwise. Germans knew. Germans participated. Germans had choices, and thousands chose to inform. And after the war, when those thousands should have faced justice, the system failed, not because the crimes were too complex, not because the evidence was missing, but because prosecuting collaborators meant admitting collaboration was widespread. It meant admitting that Nazi terror couldn't have succeeded without ordinary German cooperation. It meant admitting that the neighbor who baked you bread might have sent your other neighbor to Dachau. It meant shattering the myth of the innocent German population oppressed by a small Nazi elite. So the prosecutions stopped. The convictions dried up. The sentences got lighter. And the denouncers lived. They lived long lives in reconstructed Germany. They collected pensions. They raised children. They watched their grandchildren. They never spoke about what they did. And most were never asked. The 603 convictions out of 7,674 prosecutions tell the story. 7.8% conviction rate for a crime that made genocide possible, for a crime that sent hundreds of thousands to camps, for a crime that required nothing but words. Open your mouth. Point your finger. Say a name. Watch what happens. The crime required no uniform, no training, no orders, just willingness, just spite, just self-interest, just the smallest surrender of humanity in exchange for safety. Advantage or revenge? The Nuremberg trials created a record. They documented Nazi crimes in excruciating detail. They established that individuals, even state leaders, can be held accountable for crimes against humanity. They set precedents for international criminal law that endure today. But Nuremberg prosecuted 22 men. The subsequent Nuremberg proceedings prosecuted 177. Even if you add the thousands of trials in individual occupation zones, the total barely scratches the surface. Hundreds of thousands of people participated in Nazi crimes. Only a fraction faced trial. Only a sliver faced conviction. Only a handful faced meaningful punishment. The machinery of murder involved millions. The machinery of justice involved thousands. And the machine of accountability broke down almost immediately. This is not hindsight. This is not revisionist history. This was recognized at the time. In January 1946, the military government issues a report decrying denazification's inefficiency. The report states, the present procedure fails in practice to reach a substantial number of persons who supported or assisted the Nazis. The report is ignored. The German Jewish émigrés working for the Allies to select anti-Nazi officials for key positions are marginalized. Karl Lowenstein, hired by the Office of Military Government, United States, to advise the legal division, constantly criticizes his colleagues for ignorance of German affairs. He predicts that the early return of sovereignty to Germans will pave the way for Nazis to return to public life. He is correct. By the 1950s, former Nazis hold positions throughout West German government, business, and society. Some estimates suggest that in the late 1950s, over half of senior civil servants in some ministries had Nazi party membership. The Federal Intelligence Service The West German equivalent of the CIA employs former SS and Gestapo officers. Continuity of personnel ensures continuity of silence. The denunciators are part of this continuity. They are the teachers, the clerks, the bureaucrats, the neighbors. They are the people who file tax returns and register births and issue permits. They are woven into the fabric of post-war Germany. Prosecuting them means unraveling that fabric. It means asking uncomfortable questions. Who informed on whom? Who benefited from whose deportation? Who took whose apartment? Who got whose job? The questions are too dangerous. The answers threaten stability. So the questions stop being asked, the trials end, the files close, and the denouncers age into grandparents who never tell their grandchildren what they did in the war. One late reveal reframes everything. In 2011, Germany prosecutes 91-year-old John Demjanjuk, a camp guard at Sobibor. He is convicted as an accessory to the murder of 28,060 people. The prosecution argues that without guards like Demjanjuk, the camp couldn't function. He was essential, even if replaceable. This legal theory, that participation in the machinery makes you guilty of the machinery's crimes, is the theory that should have convicted denunciators in 1946. Without denouncers, the Gestapo couldn't function. They were essential, even if replaceable. Their reports fed the system. Their information enabled arrests. Their accusations sealed fates. If a camp guard is guilty for making the camp work, an informer is guilty for making the terror state work. But in 2011, the denouncers are long dead. The theory arrives 65 years too late. Justice delayed is justice denied. Justice this delayed is justice abandoned. The denunciation officers, the ordinary Germans, who turned neighbor against neighbor, faced trials in only a fraction of cases. They faced conviction in a fraction of trials. They faced punishment in a fraction of convictions. Most received light sentences. Many walked free. Some were never charged. The system that prosecuted high-level Nazis with international tribunals and executions failed to prosecute low-level collaboration with the same vigor. The system that documented genocide in exhaustive detail failed to document denunciation with the same precision. The system that promised accountability delivered it incompletely. And the denouncers who survived to 1955 watched the occupation end. They watched Germany regain sovereignty. They watched the West German economic miracle. They watched their country rebuild. They watched their past fade. They never paid. Most of them never paid. This is the brutal truth. The fate of denunciation officers after World War II was not hanging. It was not imprisonment. It was not exile. It was integration. It was silence. It was forgetting. It was life. They lived. While the people they denounced lay in mass graves across Europe, the denouncers lived. While 6 million Jews were ash, the denouncers lived. While millions of others, Romani, disabled, gay, political prisoners, were erased, the denouncers lived. They lived because the system that should have held them accountable collapsed under the weight of its own ambition, under the pressure of Cold War politics, under the exhaustion of a defeated nation, and under the quiet complicity of a society that preferred amnesia to admission. They lived because prosecuting them meant prosecuting Germany, and post-war Germany wasn't ready for that truth. The truth is not a monument. It is not carved in stone and left in a public square. It is a seed, and for decades after 1945, the German soil was deliberately poisoned to prevent it from growing. We know the numbers. 7,674 prosecutions for denunciation, 603 convictions, a conviction rate of less than 8%. We know the outcome. The vast majority of those who fed names to the Gestapo, who turned whispers into death sentences, simply went home. But what was home? What does a nation do when it is filled with millions of silent accomplices, each one a walking and breathing crime scene? The question is not just what happened to them legally. The question is what happened to Germany, a country that chose to live with its ghosts by pretending they did not exist. The answer begins not in a courtroom, but in the ruins, the stun de null, the 0 hour. 1945. Germany is a corpse of a country. 49 million cubic meters of rubble in Berlin alone. 7 million homes destroyed nationwide. The average German civilian in the British zone receives 1,050 calories a day, less than half of what is needed to sustain life. In this landscape of raw survival, the past is a luxury. Justice is an abstraction. The need for bread, for coal, for a roof that does not leak is absolute. This is the first layer of forgetting, necessity. A man searching for a potato for his starving child does not have time to ponder his neighbor's complicity in the previous regime. The collective trauma of defeat, hungering, and loss is so overwhelming that it crowds out the moral trauma of guilt. Then comes the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. By the 1950s, West Germany is rebuilding at a furious pace. New factories rise from the rubble. The Volkswagen Beetle becomes a symbol of a nation on the move, a nation looking forward, always forward, the relentless. Hammering noise of construction becomes the nation's soundtrack, a deafening beat that drowns out the quiet, nagging questions of the past. Progress becomes the new morality. A rising gross domestic product is treated as a form of national redemption. Why excavate the mass graves of memory when you can lay the foundation for a new department store? This economic miracle is also a psychological one. It provides a new identity. Germans are no longer Nazis or collaborators or bystanders. They are builders, hard workers, economic champions. Concrete covers the cracks in the national conscience. The denouncer who sent a family to Auschwitz now works on an assembly line, building refrigerators. He pays his taxes. He obeys the new laws. He is a productive member of society. To question him is to question the recovery itself. It is to threaten the miracle. Within this new, busy, forward-looking nation, a silent pact is forged. A generational contract written in invisible ink. The war generation, the Kriegs generation, does not speak. Their children, the first post-war generation, learn not to ask. The German family dinner table becomes a masterclass in omission. The past is a fourth wall, an invisible barrier everyone pretends is not there. A father's limp from a wound on the Eastern Front is explained as a sports injury. A mother's sudden bouts of weeping are dismissed as nerves. The empty chairs of murdered relatives are never mentioned. The denunciator lives within this pact. His children know he was alive during the war. They know he was not a victim. But they do not ask the follow-up question. So what were you? They do not ask because they are terrified of the answer. They do not want to know that the man who taught them to ride a bike might have been a monster. And the father does not speak because of shame or fear, or because he has constructed a version of the past where he is the hero, or at least a blameless bystander. He tells himself he had no choice. He tells himself he was protecting his own family. He tells himself the people he denounced were criminals anyway. He repeats these lies until they feel like memories. This personal silence is mirrored by a public one. The new West German state needs functionaries. It needs judges, teachers, police officers, and civil servants. And the only people with the experience to do these jobs are the same people who did them under the Nazis. The denazification program, as we saw, was a failure. So the mailman who delivered deportation notices in 1943 is still delivering the mail in 1953. The judge who sentenced a man to death for listening to the BBC is now sitting on a traffic court. And the clerk who processed the paperwork stripping Jewish families of their property is now processing pension applications. This created a state of mass cognitive dissonance. How can you condemn the Nazi past when it is sitting right in front of you, stamping your documents? You cannot. Instead, you normalize it. You tell yourself that these were just people doing their jobs. You accept the continuity because the alternative is chaos. This is how the denunciators vanished in plain sight. They did not run. They did not hide. They just stayed put. They became the system. All over again. But silence, like a vacuum, cannot hold forever. In 1961, the glass wall of German denial begins to crack. In a courtroom in Jerusalem, the State of Israel puts Adolf Eichmann on trial. For the first time, German televisions broadcast hours of Holocaust survivor testimony directly into German living rooms. Germans hear, in their own language, about the mechanics of genocide. They hear not just about the monsters at the top, but about the bureaucrats, the schedulers, the desk murderers like Eichmann. The trial popularizes Hannah Arendt's phrase, the banality of evil. Evil is not always a man in a black uniform with a skull on his hat. Evil can be your neighbor. Evil can be a quiet man who files reports. The Eichmann trial makes the abstract horror concrete, and it plants a dangerous seed in the minds of the younger generation. If this ordinary-looking man could do this, what did my ordinary-looking father do? 2 years later, the cracks widen. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials begin in 1963 and run for 20 months. This is not a foreign court. This is Germans prosecuting Germans on German soil, day after day. The newspapers print excerpts of the testimony. The brutal, sadistic, and mind-numbing reality of the camps becomes public knowledge in a way it never was before. The excuse, "we didn't know," becomes impossible to sustain. You could not open a newspaper without knowing. You could not turn on the radio without knowing. For the denunciator, this period must have been a quiet hell. Imagine the man who informed on his Jewish neighbors in 1942, sitting at his breakfast table in 1964. He reads the testimony of an Auschwitz survivor describing the arrival of a transport from his very city. On the very date his neighbors were taken, he reads about the selections, the gas chambers, the crematoria. For the first time, The direct, undeniable consequence of his phone call is laid bare. The anonymity he hid behind is stripped away. The state did the rest, yes, but he started it. He was the first link in the chain of murder. This new, unavoidable knowledge fuels a rebellion. The children of the Pact of Silence, now university students, explode with rage. The student movements of 1968 are not just about Vietnam or capitalism. In Germany, they are about the past. They are about patricide. The generation born in the ruins turns on the generation that built them. They see their parents' economic miracle as blood money. They see the polite silence of their society as complicity. They scream the question their parents never wanted to hear. Was hast du im Krieg gemacht? What did you do in the war? They confront their professors, their politicians, their own fathers and mothers. They expose the ex-Nazis still holding positions of power. They reject the entire post-war consensus of forgetting. For the denunciator, life becomes a minefield. The past is no longer a distant country. It is an active threat. Every knock on the door could be a journalist. Every phone call could be a researcher. Every new acquaintance could be the child of someone they informed on seeking answers. They retreat deeper into their silence, their denial hardening into a bitter, defensive shell. They see the student protesters as ungrateful children, defiling the memory of a generation that suffered. They frame themselves as the true victims, misunderstood and unfairly judged by those who were not there. Their justification becomes their identity. To admit guilt now, after 20 years of lies, would be to unravel their entire existence. So they hold on. They watch the world change around them, a world that is beginning to remember what they spent a lifetime trying to forget. Most of them succeed. They carry their secrets to the grave. The statute of limitations for most of their crimes has long since passed. The political will for new prosecutions is gone. They die of old age in their beds, surrounded by families who may have their suspicions, but have learned once again not to ask. They receive pensions from the state they both served and betrayed. Their obituaries in the local paper list them as loving fathers and respected community members. There is no mention of the letters they wrote, the phone calls they made, the lives they destroyed. The failure to prosecute the denunciators was not just a legal failure. It was a moral catastrophe. It left a poison in the groundwater of the new Germany. It taught a terrible lesson that the most intimate form of betrayal, the turning of neighbor against neighbor, carries no price. It allowed hundreds of thousands of individual acts of evil to be subsumed into the abstract crime of a faceless regime. It severed the connection between action and consequence, and it placed the burden of memory on the victims, while the perpetrators were granted the comfort of amnesia. The men at Nuremberg were tried and hanged. Their guilt was absolute, their punishment public. But the terror state they built was not a pyramid with only a few men at the top. It was a vast network, a web of complicity that reached into every apartment block, every office, every village. The denunciators were the nodes of this network. They were the sensors of the system. Without them, the Gestapo was blind. Without them, the Holocaust would have been impossible on the scale it was achieved. They were the enablers, and they walked free. They lived, and in their quiet, unpunished lives, we see the coldest truth of all. Justice is not inevitable. It is not a force of nature. It is a choice. And in the ashes of the Third Reich, it was a choice that was, in the end, too difficult to make. The debt was never paid. It was just forgotten.